The Zealan and the Valari would not negotiate. Kel's voice thundered through the great hall, his 6 eyes narrowing as he surveyed the gathered delegates. This council wastes time while war prepares to consume entire systems. A wave of reactions rippled through the chamber. Displays flickered, showing war-torn regions, fleets massing along burning borders, entire sectors already scarred by battle. The vast circular chamber pulsed with heated voices. The Valari refuse all diplomatic attempts, a delegate from the Kashari Compact spat, his tendrils shifting restlessly. They view compromise as weakness. How do you negotiate with those who see surrender in every concession? The Zalan are no different, the Silharan Trade Alliance delegate added. His elongated arms, covered in shifting bioluminescent feathers, lashed out against his console, emitting a sharp trilling, noise his species' equivalent of outrage. They only understand force. If we do not intervene, their war will spill into council-controlled space. And how do you propose we intervene? Another delegate shot back. A blockade? Sanctions? We all know how little they care for. Diplomacy. The only thing stopping this war is fear of the other's retaliation. A ripple of uneasy silence followed, broken only by the hum of council systems processing and displaying data. The harsh glow of the galactic map reflected off the polished chamber floor, spinning projections of casualty estimates, fleet maneuvers, and strategic failures. Then, a voice cut through the chaos. The humans volunteer. Silence slammed into the room like a kinetic blast. Dozens of eyes, organic and artificial, swiveled toward the speaker. Chancellor Benedict Adepo stood firm, his hands clasped behind his back, the sharp lines of his diplomatic uniform unmoving beneath the weight of every gaze now pinned on him. Scoff broke the silence. Vorton, the Kashari delegate, let out a dry, clicking laugh. Humans, you are barely out of your own system. You expect the Council to entrust you with mediating a war that has outlasted your species' presence in space? Your kind is impulsive, a representative from the Iron Coalition added, his mandibles twitching in distaste. Strategically reckless, emotionally volatile. Why should we believe you're capable of handling this? Adepo didn't flinch. He moved forward slowly, letting his presence alone command the space. When he spoke, his voice was calm, firm, cutting through the lingering scoffs like a blade. Because we understand conflict. A pause. A shift in the air. We understand what it means when war is inevitable, Adepo continued. We understand how it spirals, how it consumes everything, and how sometimes the only way to prevent annihilation is by knowing when to strike and when not to. A few murmurs of dissent stirred, but Adepo pressed forward, activating the hollow emitter embedded in his podium. The galactic map twisted, zooming in on a cluster of stars near the Orion Spur. 20 standard cycles ago, the Zra Dominion began a systematic purge of the Aridin cluster. You remember this conflict. He didn't pose it as a question. A minor skirmish, the Council called it. A contained engagement. But we knew what it was. The hollow image shifted, replaying grainy footage of desolate planets, charred cities, stations left adrift with their life support systems severed. The room, once filled with arguments and scorn, grew still. You deliberated, Adepo said, his tone sharpening. You debated in this very chamber while entire systems died, while colonies suffocated under siege. The image flickered again. A new fleet, sleek and dark, emerged from the void. Then a single human task force arrived. The footage rolled forward. 12 ships, dwarfed by a Dominion fleet 3 times their size, ghosted through the void. Drives. Cold, hulls painted to deflect scans. Silent entry, no transmissions. Then, impact. Kinetic strikes shattered Dominion supply lines with precision. Covert teams, armored in adaptive exosuits, breached command stations in synchronized maneuvers. Dominion officers barely had time to react before their command links went dark. Their fleet, suddenly leaderless, was confused. The enemy never saw them coming. Adipo's voice was unwavering. In one night, we shattered their blockade. We cut their command structure at the throat. We rescued millions, while the rest of you deliberated. Silence. The weight of the truth bore down on the chamber. Adipo let it sit before delivering the final blow. You underestimate us now, just as you did then. The chamber erupted, not with dismissal, but with discourse. Voices raised, debating, arguing, calculating. The humans are scavengers of war, nothing more. They brawl among themselves even now, their own history a testament to their savagery. And yet, despite their brutality, they have survived, adapted, excelled. Perhaps that is exactly what is needed here. Kell leaned forward, his elongated fingers drumming against his armrest. And you believe humanity alone can mediate this war? Adipo's expression remained impassive. I believe we are the only ones willing to do what is necessary to prevent it. He let the words settle, reading the chamber's shifting tide. The hesitation, the calculation, the reluctant consideration. Then, the supreme arbiter, his ancient form draped in ceremonial robes interwoven with the insignia of 1,000 worlds, lifted a withered hand. The murmurs ceased instantly. His voice, though frail, carried the weight of centuries. The council will discuss the matter. Adipo held his ground a moment longer, his gaze sweeping across the gathered delegates. He let the weight of his words linger, then spoke just loud enough for the chamber to hear. Of course, debate is, after all, the most efficient weapon against war, a few voices grumbled, others stiffened, unreadable. Kell leaned forward, his dark eyes locked onto the human chancellor. His elongated fingers drummed once against his armrest before. He exhaled a slow breath. Enough, he said at last, though his voice carried little conviction. Let them try. A ripple of discomfort passed through the chamber. Vorton's mandibles clicked in protest, his voice a low hiss of contempt. This is insanity. They will only escalate the conflict. The Silharan delegate's feathers flared with agitation. Another voice from the shadows added, If the humans fail, the blood of entire systems will be on this council's hands. The Supreme Arbiter's withered hand lifted slightly, silencing the murmurs. His gaze, old, as empires, settled on Adipo. Then let them carry that burden. If the humans fail, his voice was barely above a whisper, this council will not clean up their mess. Adipo did not blink. Then we will not give you a mess to clean. A final pause. A breath held. The Supreme Arbiter exhaled slowly, his withered hand lowered. The council agrees. Adipo did not exhale in relief. Instead, he stepped forward, just enough to make his presence undeniable. Humanity does not waste opportunities, he said, nor do we hesitate in the face of crisis. We will act immediately. The docking bay vibrated with a deep metallic groan as the airlocks pressurized. Steam hissed through the vent systems, filling the narrow corridors with a brief mist before vanishing into the sterile cold of the station's controlled atmosphere. Footsteps thudded against the reinforced floor as Chancellor Benedict Adipo walked toward the receiving chamber, his pace calm, but his shoulders taut. Behind him, Mira Vasquez scanned every corner, her hand hovering near her sidearm. Security teams lined the walls, their postures rigid, weapons holstered but ready. The tension was suffocating. Adipo stopped just short of the reinforced doors. Status? His voice was steady, but the weight behind it made it clear he expected. No hesitation. A technician worked rapidly at the security console, swallowing hard. Both delegations have docked. The Velari lead ship arrived first, 5 minutes ahead of schedule. The Zalan fleet entered the system almost simultaneously. Adipo's jaw clenched. They hadn't coordinated their arrivals, which meant their timing was either a calculated message or a dangerous coincidence. Either way, it was gasoline poured over an already raging fire. The doors split open with a hydraulic hiss. Inside, the chamber was vast, yet somehow suffocating. A sterile meeting, space void of any markings or insignias. The Galactic Council had ensured neutrality down to the details. No banners, no decorative architecture, only cold metal, reinforced shielding, and the ever-present hum of automated security systems monitoring every movement and every breath. Then, they arrived. The Zealon came first. Heavy footsteps pounded against the floor as General Oro stepped forward, his hulking frame wrapped in the segmented armor of his kind. His exoskeletal plating flexed with each motion, deep crimson etchings carved into his shoulder ridges like war trophies. His eyes, two pits of seething red, scanned the room like a predator evaluating prey. Behind him, his entourage spread out, instinctively positioning themselves in subtle but effective defensive formations. Then came the Valari. They moved fluidly, their elongated forms wrapped in shimmering, reflective garments that pulsed faintly with shifting hues. High Strategist Veron glided forward, his violet skin flickering with bioluminescent signals that only his own people could fully interpret. His eyes locked onto Oro with immediate disdain. The moment stretched, an invisible tension coiling in, the air thick and unrelenting. Oro's mandibles clicked once. "You waste my time." Veron's lips curled slightly, his voice smooth but edged with ice. "Time spent avoiding war is never wasted, though I suspect you lack the patience for such complexities." A low growl rumbled from Oro's chest. His soldiers shifted behind him. Adepo stepped between them before the first insult turned into the first strike. "You're both here because the alternative is extinction," he said, voice like a blade, against steel. Oro's head snapped toward him. "Do not speak as if you command me, human." Adepo's expression didn't shift. "Then do not act like a fool." Silence. The weight of his words pressed against the room, a deliberate force that neither leader had expected. Oro's claws flexed at his sides, but he didn't move. Veron simply observed, his expression unreadable. Mira remained on Adepo's flank, barely moving, her eyes tracking every micro-expression, every flick of a muscle. Veron exhaled slowly. "If nothing else, the humans are amusing." Adepo ignored the bait. "You will both state your positions, you will both listen, and you will not waste my time with petty displays." Oro let out a slow, guttural snarl, but whether it was anger or amusement was unclear. Veron simply inclined his head. Then, just as Adepo opened his mouth to speak, a tremor ran through the floor, so faint it could have been imagination. A whisper of something wrong. Then the room shook. A deep, concussive blast ripped through the station. The lights flickered, red alarms flaring to life, sirens howling through the walls. The ground lurched beneath them as reinforced shielding slammed into place, sealing the chamber. For a fraction of a second, everything stood still. No movement. No words. Just the void swallowing the dying embers of the blast. Mira's voice cut through the chaos. "Report!" She pressed a hand to her earpiece, already moving. Adepo's gaze snapped toward the viewport. Beyond the reinforced glass, a Valari cruiser was burning. A violent explosion had ruptured its midsection, tearing through its elegant hull with terrifying precision. Bodies and debris tumbled into the void, silent against the backdrop of space. No warning. No energy readings. No traceable projectile. It had come from nowhere. The reaction was instant. Oro's soldiers snapped into formation, weapons half raised, their mandibles flaring in fury. "Treachery!" Oro roared, his body surging forward, his claws nearly reaching for Varen's throat. The Valari commander did not flinch. Instead, his eyes darkened, his stance shifting. A convenient strike just as we arrived in neutral territory. Adepo moved before the first blow landed, shoving himself between them. "Stand down." His voice cracked through the room, sharp, enough to cut through the ringing alarms. No one moved. Varan's fingers twitched at his sides, his bioluminescence pulsing in jagged, unreadable patterns. The Zellans saw an opportunity. They took it. Oro's chest heaved. You think we would need to sabotage your fragile ships? You insult me. You insult yourself if you think this deception will work, Varan countered. The accusations spiraled, voices rising, the air thick with the imminent collapse of diplomacy. Security teams tensed, waiting for the inevitable. Then, Mira's voice cut through the noise. Chancellor, something's wrong. Adepo turned sharply. Explain, she was staring at the security console, her brow furrowed. Our sensors didn't pick up anything before the blast. No launch trajectory, no external energy spike. There was nothing. Adepo's mind raced. No energy spike, no weapon signatures, nothing. That wasn't an oversight. That was intentional. His pulse quickened. That's not possible. Exactly, Mira muttered. Oro's mandibles twitched. Another lie. Think, brute, Varan hissed. No ship can fire without leaving a trace. Unless you know something we do not. Oro snarled, stepping forward again. But this time, Mira moved in a blur. Her weapon was unholstered, aimed, directly between the two leaders. Try it, she said, her voice dangerously calm. The room fell into stillness. Adepo exhaled slowly. Both of you, step back, now. Oro's chest heaved, his claws flexing, but he didn't advance. Varan remained still. His expression unreadable, Adepo turned to Mira. Get me a full scan of the area, find out what the hell just happened. She nodded, already working. Outside, the Valari cruiser continued to burn. Adepo turned back to the warring leaders, his thoughts racing. No readings, no energy spikes, no warnings. This was no accident. Someone wanted this meeting to fail, and the only question was, who? The aftermath of the explosion cast a grim shadow over the meeting. Alarms still howled through the station. The red emergency lights flickering across the tense faces of the delegations. Outside, the wreckage of the Valari cruiser drifted through space, its broken hull glowing faintly as the last traces of atmosphere vented into the void. Adepo stood motionless, his mind working through every possibility. The explosion had been precise, deliberate, and timed to ensure that this negotiation collapsed before it had even begun. But there had been no weapon signatures, no energy spikes, nothing detectable. This was sabotage. But from whom? Mira's voice cut through the silence. Chancellor, we have preliminary scans. Adepo turned sharply. Go ahead. She looked pale, but her voice was steady. There are no traces of external projectile impact. No kinetic damage, no residual radiation from energy weapons. She hesitated. The explosion originated from within the ship. A ripple of realization passed through the room. Oro's eyes flared. A Valari trick, then? His claws clenched into fists. You destroy your own ship to place the blame on us? Varan's expression darkened, his bioluminescence flashing, in rapid pulses. Do not insult my intelligence, General. My people do not sacrifice themselves for theatrics. You expect me to believe that? Oro snarled. Adepo stepped forward. Enough! Both commanders turned toward him, their expressions still taut with suspicion and rage. This was not an act of desperation. This was precision, Adepo said, his voice low but commanding. Someone wanted to ensure this meeting collapsed, and if the explosion came from inside the ship, it means the enemy was already among us. A heavy silence settled over the room. Mira's earpiece buzzed, and she pressed a hand against it. After a moment, she turned back to Adepo. Sir, we've retrieved debris samples. The ship's structural integrity failed before the explosion. We found molecular destabilization in the hull fragments. Adepo's pulse quickened. Destabilization? Mira nodded grimly. This wasn't a standard explosive device. It was something engineered to break the ship apart from within. Something advanced. Veron's fingers twitched at his side. That level of technology is rare, even among council militaries. Oro crossed his arms. Then who has it? Adepo's jaw tightened. That's what we need to find out. A communication request flared on the holo table, an encrypted transmission. Mira analyzed it before nodding. It's from Admiral Usmani. Adepo activated the transmission. A crisp image of Admiral Gerard Usmani flickered into view. His gray hair was cropped short, his uniform pristine despite the weight of the situation. Behind him, the bridge of the Oblivion, the flagship of the human expeditionary fleet, was alive with quiet tension. Chancellor, Usmani began, his voice steady but urgent. We've been analyzing the attack on the Valari vessel. I'm sending you our findings now. Data scrolled across the holo display. Adepo scanned it quickly, his stomach tightening with each new line of information. Mira stiffened. That energy signature, it doesn't match Zelan or Valari. Weaponry, Usmani confirmed. It doesn't match anything in council records. Adepo exhaled slowly. Then where does it come from? There was a pause. Usmani's expression hardened. There's been a name circulating in intelligence reports, he said. A faction that doesn't officially exist. A shadow force that sells weapons to the highest bidder, that manipulates wars before they even begin. Adepo's grip tightened. The Drac. The name alone sent a chill through the chamber. Oro and Veron exchanged sharp glances. The Drac, Veron murmured. They're mercenaries, information brokers, arms dealers. They have no loyalty to any government, only to profit. Oro's claws flexed. And you think they would orchestrate this war? For what? Chaos is profitable, Adepo said, his voice quiet. And they don't just sell weapons. They sell wars. Usmani nodded. We traced unusual trade routes moving through unregulated space. Weapons shipments that bypassed both your territories, but somehow still ended up in your fleets. Oro's mandibles clicked together sharply. Lies. No, Veron said, his gaze flickering between the data streams. Not lies. We were manipulated. Oro turned on him. You accept this so easily? Veron's bioluminescence dimmed. I accept evidence. If we continue this war, we bleed ourselves dry, and if we fall, the Drac profit. Adepo watched the two commanders carefully. This war was never yours, he said. It was engineered. Silence. Then slowly, Oro exhaled, his claws unclenched. What do you propose, human? Adepo didn't hesitate. A ceasefire, a temporary alliance to track down the Drac and eliminate their influence. Oro hesitated, then gave a sharp nod. I will take this to my war council. Veron inclined his head. And I to mine. Adepo straightened. Then we move quickly, before the Drac force our hand. As the delegates departed, Mira stepped closer to Adepo. Do you think they'll hold to it? Adepo's gaze remained fixed on the holo display, where the evidence of manipulation still flickered. They have no choice, he said. Because if they don't, this war will be the least of their concerns. Far from the diplomatic station, in the depths of unregulated space, Supreme Commander Kasich of the Drac sat in the shadows of his warship's command deck, watching the negotiations unfold through intercepted transmissions. His bioluminescent markings pulsed in slow amusement. So, he murmured, his voice a cold whisper. The humans think they can stop what has already begun. He leaned forward, tapping a command into his console. A dozen warships powered up in the darkness, their signatures masked, their weapons primed. Let's see how long they last. The void trembled. The war was far from over. The Drac fleet emerged from the void like ghosts, their blackened warships slipping through the darkness, invisible to all but the most advanced sensors. Their weapons remained cold, their engines barely whispering. Supreme Commander Kasich sat in the shadows of his command bridge, his bioluminescent markings pulsing in slow, deliberate amusement. The humans had uncovered his hand in this war, but it didn't matter. The wheels were already in motion. "Prepare. The strike teams," Kasich ordered, his voice a low rasp. "Deploy the destabilizers. The Zalan and Valari will tear each other apart before they ever see the real enemy." His second-in-command hesitated. "And the humans?" Kasich's markings pulsed again. "They will fight until they break." Then he leaned forward, watching as the battle below unfolded. "Let's see how long they last." The void trembled. The war was far from over. The Zalan and Valari fleets converged at the edge of neutral space, their warships burning into real space in a chaotic, battle-ready formation. The fragile diplomacy that had existed for a brief moment had collapsed. They no longer spoke through envoys. Now their weapons would speak for them. Inside the Oblivion, Admiral Gerard Usmani stood over the tactical display, watching the two armadas prepare to obliterate one another. The human fleet, positioned between them, was outnumbered and outgunned. They had inserted themselves into this war, and now they were standing in the way of two superpowers about to collide. "This war was never theirs," Usmani muttered. "And yet here we are." A tense silence hung over the bridge. Then, Chancellor Adepo's voice cut through it like a knife. "Broadcast the evidence." The command was immediate. Across every Zalan and Valari ship, intercepted transmissions from the Drac played out in real time. The logs of secret weapons deals, the manufactured conflicts, the forged attacks, the hidden puppet strings that had led them to this moment. The war was never theirs. The two fleets hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty cracked through the rage, and that was when the Drac struck. From the shadows of space, the Drac fleet decloaked, their weapons already primed. They had never intended to let their manipulated pawns stop fighting. Their ships fired first, not at the humans, not at the Valari, not at the Zalan, but at all three. A massive explosion shattered the bridge of a Zalan battleship, its hull splitting apart like paper. A Valari war cruiser vanished in a flash of white-hot destruction. A human escort frigate was severed in two. Panic exploded across all channels. "This is a trap!" Varan's voice snapped through the comms, the Valari admiral's bioluminescence flickering erratically. "We are under attack!" General Oro roared. His rage now turned to the true enemy. On the Oblivion's bridge, Captain Cunningham slammed his fist onto the console. Those bastards waited for the perfect moment to strike. Adepo's face was stone. "Then we make. Sure, it's their last mistake." The human fleet moved first. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and surrounded, but humanity had never won through brute strength alone. They had won through strategy. "Their formation is meant to divide us," Usmani said, his voice cold and sharp. "They want us fighting separate battles." "We don't give them that chance," Adepo answered. He switched channels, addressing both Valari and Zalan leaders at once. "Your fleets will not survive alone. Work with us, or you will die. As pawns." Oro hesitated for only a second. Then his voice growled through the comms. "We fight together." Veron's bioluminescence flickered a different shade. Agreement. For the first time in history, Zalan, Valari, and humans fought as one. The battle erupted in fire and steel. The Drac fleet fought with unmatched precision, their warships twisting through the void like phantoms. They were built for subterfuge, for ambushes, for manipulating others into destroying themselves. They were not built for open war, and that was their weakness. The humans led the charge. The Oblivion and its fleet dove headfirst into the Drac formation, their weapons blazing. They fought like cornered beasts, because that was what they were. Humanity had been backed into wars before, and every time they had emerged stronger. The Valari moved with precision, their ships darting between enemy fire, disrupting formations with speed and deception. The Zalan brought sheer power, unleashing heavy bombardments that shattered entire Drac squadrons. The three fleets, once enemies, became an unstoppable force. One by one, the Drac ships fell. One of the Drac command carriers, detonated as a human battleship, tore through its hull with railgun fire. A Valari strike squad infiltrated the enemy flagship, cutting off their command network. A Zelan dreadnought obliterated their last remaining heavy cruiser. As the battle turned, Kasich knew he had lost. His war had failed. The Drac had played with war for centuries. This time, they had lost their own game. His officers turned toward him, waiting for orders, waiting for him to salvage something. He had nothing. Kasich exhaled. Burn everything. A final suicide command was transmitted to the remaining Drac. Ships. They would self-destruct before they were captured. They would not allow themselves to be taken. But humanity had learned from them. Before the Drac could detonate, a human cyber warfare team hacked their command systems, overriding the self-destruct protocols. Their ships were now defenseless, and the final shots were fired. The Drac were erased, their warships burned, their name, their legacy, gone. Supreme Commander Kasich's last sight was the Oblivion unleashing its final barrage. Then there was only silence. The battlefield was quiet. The Drac were gone. Their fleet annihilated, their schemes exposed. On the Oblivion's bridge, Usmani stood motionless, watching the flames die in the distance. Adepo exhaled. It's over. Across the channels, Valari and Zelan commanders stared at their shattered fleets, enemies for generations. Now, standing on the same side of history, Varan spoke first. You saved us. Oro's voice was quieter than usual. Perhaps we saved each other. Adepo didn't smile. There was no triumph in war, only survival. But this was something different. The Drac had tried to make them destroy one another. Instead, they had forged something new. Varan's bioluminescence flickered softly. We need to talk. Adepo nodded. Yes, we do. For the first time in galactic history, the three greatest civilizations in the galaxy sat at the same table, not as enemies, but as something else. The war that was never theirs had ended, and a new future had begun.